I left school in 1990 when I was 16, and just the year before the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Soviet Union was collapsing. The world was changing. A book was written called The End of History, which sounds humorous now, but it wasn't at the time. But that's what it felt like. Growing up in the 80s, Moscow had been portrayed as the headquarters of the evil empire. And then it was in the headlines for getting its first McDonald's. I'm ashamed to say this now, but teenage me was a bit disappointed. I'd grown up, as many of my generation had, on stories of the Second World War. My school years had been in the Cold War, and now my old adult years beckoned. I was going to live the rest of my life in a world where the most notable events would be the opening of branches of McDonald's all over the planet. And I thought that were a bit boring, as daft as it seems. I needn't have worried. Within a year, the first Gulf War had happened, followed by the Balkan Wars, then 9/11, then the Second Gulf War, the invasion of Afghanistan, and then, when it looked like it was calming down, a plague swept the globe, killing millions and confining most of the developed world to virtual house arrest for nearly a year. So much for the end of history. And I was reminded of all this in my last job. Before I became an ordinand, I worked in a special school. And our school, with it being a special school, it opened up during the first lockdown, before there were vaccines or anything. And one of the older pupils, a fairly abrasive, clever but funny lad, he was complaining to me about having to go into school when all his mates were off. Why was his the only school in the area where they had to go in? Now, he'd got a really dark sense of humour, so I joked with him and I said, let's call it immersive learning. Instead of having me boring you to death about the Great Plagues and the Black Death, now we get to go to school in the middle of a plague, see what it's like. He grinned at me and then just got on with it. But then a few months later, he gave me a weary grin and joked back. He said, "Sir, can we just stop living through history for a bit and go back to reading about it? I've had enough. I'm getting sick of it." Now, there were a couple of adjectives in his version that I don't feel comfy repeating in church, but I took his point. And I'm sure a lot of us have felt that way over the last couple of years, just to wish to get back to that boring but safe old world. What felt safe about that old world? I think it was control. Not being buffeted by events such as shortages, price hikes, threats of war, and dreaded new variants. In today's reading, we read the story of the Tower of Babel. We're still in early Genesis. Two major things have happened to God's creation before this event. Firstly, there was the fall. Adam and Eve did the one thing God commanded them not to, and in doing so, they lost the paradise of Eden. A few generations later, the human race had become so corrupt that God wished he'd never created mankind. Then the flood. We start again. And when they do start again, God speaks words that sound like an echo of those said to Adam and Eve. Be fruitful and increase and fill the earth. But within another few generations, the human race, speaking one language, is building itself a city. So they won't be split up. So they won't be scattered through the earth, with a tower that reaches to heaven in order to make a name for themselves. It's like nothing's been learned. There's still no respect for what God has asked, and no trust in God. We can presume that the city they're building would give them the illusion of safety, domesticity, all not relying on God, with a tower to the heavens celebrating that self-reliance, as if to insult God. God goes down to look at this tower, And having seen what humans are already capable of, speaking one language, he splits everybody up. He disperses the human race, confuses its speech into all the different languages, saying, if there's one people speaking the same language, they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. At first, this sounds like God is angry that people are so capable. Why would he not want the beings he created to be capable of great things? In Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make mankind in our own image." So one would imagine humans being capable of reason and creation. Like God, that would be what he intended. But what is lacking in humans to go with this godlike reason and creativity? Well, so far it would appear faith in God and his goodness. There's no trust in God. If they're huddled together in a city they have built to keep themselves safe, they're not doing as God asked. He asked them to fill the earth. There's no faith in God if the centrepiece of that city isn't a temple to God, but a tower to celebrate their own greatness. But why would God be so concerned? After all, humans are no threat to him. That tower to the heavens, so-called, is ultimately so small, he has to go down to have a look at it. Maybe God thinks a self-reliant, self-centered people are a threat to themselves. We only have to look at the last century to see evidence of this. We had so-called scientific atheistic governments in the East and West, and they led to death camps, concentration camps, and world wars. And this godlike reason that we have, that enabled us to discover the law of physics, it also enabled us to drop two atomic bombs on cities full of civilians, including children, people shopping, working, playing, going about their business. We've designed technology, and it gives us computerized phones that we've got in our pockets. Clever. Yet people are working 18 hours a day for a pittance in hellish factories miles away so we don't have to see it. And we can get them a bit cheaper and somebody can make $1 billion in Silicon Valley. The very reason and creativity that makes us godlike makes us a bit more like the devil when it isn't directed towards or by God. And we're taught in the modern world that self-reliance is some kind of virtue. It's good to be self-reliant on ourselves. But is it? Of course, we don't want to unnecessarily burden others. We want to pull our own weight. But self-reliance soon leads to pride and a lack of love for God. How long does it take for our self-reliance to turn into bragging or being proud that we don't have to rely on people? Blaming others for their troubles. Despising others for sponging off us. It becomes easy to stop thanking God for our daily bread and instead imagine that we deserve it and earned it, and woe betide anybody who wants a slice of ours. And on a more mundane level, does it even make us happier? I don't know that it does. This illusion of control is just that. Then, when the world turns upside down through disaster, or illness, or bereavement, we realise we don't really control anything at all. And it comes as a shock, because we're not used to it. We're so used to kidding ourselves that we're in charge, we're running things. So what to make of all this in light of the story of Babel for this coming week? Well, as usual, while in this building, it's easy to say words about relying on God. Dead easy. It's easy for me standing here, it's easy for you listening to it. But tomorrow when we turn the news on, we'll probably hear about possible wars with Russia, inflation rocketing, government scandals, and there'll probably be some brand spanking new trouble we can't even see coming. And when we do, it's worth just taking a breath, a pause, and remembering the Tower of Babel. To realise that sometimes choppy waters or the ground shaking under our feet, us not being able to huddle in perfect safety, can make us look up at God rather than to ourselves or to each other, with all the trouble that can bring. This is easy to preach but hard to do, but I don't think impossible to do, because we have Jesus. This was a man who never had a place to lay his head, who knew all that faced him in this life was trouble and that it was going to end in torture and death. But he kept his gaze on the Father and said, "Not as I will, but as you will." Doing likewise, letting God control things, trusting in him, will not only be the right thing for us to do, but ultimately it will be the easiest thing for us to do, because he will look after us. I think this is part of the meaning of the words of Jesus when he said in Matthew 11:28-30, "Come to me, all you are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Amen. As we thank God for our daily bread, and as we look up to him rather than to ourselves, please stand for our second hymn, "Guide Me."